Good morning, Interop. My name is Bryan Culver from Network to Code, and today I want to talk a bit about how to go about engaging the people and processes behind enterprise adoptions, or as I like to call it, how to automate the human networks. So let's get started with the obvious. Enterprise adoption is more difficult than it is in smaller organizations. But what about small organizations makes that option easy? Well, smaller organizations are smaller. They have less people, and those people often wear multiple hats. They could be an engineer on the network team, as well as the security admin and tier 2 support. They can have less process. It's not that they have no processes, but they're often less rigid, they have looser restrictions, and they update far more easily than in larger organizations. That's often because those processes are more memorized and handed down between teams than they are codified in systems and documents that need to be routinely updated and change controlled. And when a change is impacted to an organization, it's often smaller for the negative impacts because only a handful of individuals need to be updated. The team members are often on the same team, and in small organizations, even though people do wear multiple hats, they typically are grouped together, and the impact from one team doesn't always spill over into the change in another team. But what makes small organization adoption hard? Well, they have less people. And that fewer people means fewer hands and more swivel chairing operations to get the adoption through. And they also have less process. Since it wasn't thoroughly documented before, how will you know if you've even made an improvement? And that smaller impact from change is also applied to the savings as well. The savings can be washed in the time and effort it took to even get there. But that's not what we're talking about. We're focusing on the enterprise adoption and how difficult it is. Well, I'd say that on the enterprise side, the scale tips into more difficult than it is easy. And that's because enterprises are bigger. They have more people and more separation of duties. As needs scale, so do the splitting of responsibilities. Teams form around similar duties like security teams, networking groups, and operations. And those processes that these teams create can sometimes become legacy or bulky or complicated. And that could be because other teams from other organizations that depend on this team's process for other information ask for more information gathering during that process. And those processes are codified in systems that don't always get that much attention, or they live solely in documents and PDFs. And they can have stricter requirements. It could be compliance, it could be oversight, things like ADA or regulatory and legal requirements that these organizations are bound by. And there is a larger impact from that change. Although you can have a big win for an organization and big dollar amount saved, the number of teams that need to be trained before the change is implemented and weren't there during the conception grows ever exponentially. But that's not to say enterprise adoption is all that difficult. It can be easy as well. With more people and more process, organizations can be aligned to new strategies, and cross-team groups can be spun up and quickly speed up the rate of adoption by splitting up common work streams. And enterprises have bigger and better budgets. Enterprises can afford to throw money at problems to make them go away. That could be licensing, that could be servers, that could be scaling up training. And there's an order of magnitude of cost savings as well. Audit and compliance takes time, and streamlining those processes saves a lot of people hours, and so do the day-to-day operations that get saved as well. But more importantly, whether you're a small organization or an enterprise, change is hard. Changing is difficult, and not changing is easy. Whichever analogy you use to describe it, one cannot disagree that it is easier to know what you know and don't know than it is to open the door to a world that you have just begun to discover. Now, I know you didn't come all this way to have the sizes and scales of companies explained to you, but bear with me. Because I want you to think of enterprises as networks. People are switches and routers, processes are protocols and schemas. So what does a small business network look like? The human network. Well, you have a shallow organization structure, Everyone fits on a single/24. You may only need one router or a handful of switches for the rack. There's no need for traffic zoning, as it's easy to manage the process flows between individuals. And individuals share responsibilities, not unlike an Active Directory server functioning as a DNS server and a mail server. In large organizations, you have to sometimes split these responsibilities because of the traffic and the workload, or the ability to maintain and upgrade them. And so in a small organization, it's easy to make one change and impact a lot of improvement because there's so few things to touch. And it's easy to readily share that information between team members. There's no additional routes and proxies needed to get between teams or advisory boards or review process or evaluations. Everything exists in a single rack or in a single office, and you can quickly have a lunch and learn on a new process or strategy. And those affected by the process are often involved in the change anyway. And although they may not be implementing the change, the person that sits next to them is the one that's patching everything and can quickly train everyone in minutes and not days or weeks. In contrast, the enterprise business human network works with teams instead of just people. They're typically load balanced, as in they have a manager or they rotate responsibilities and they have groups for high availability of the team's attention to needs of the other teams of the organization. You often have delegated responsibilities. You'll see this in VLANing or subnetting of different traffic types. And teams have information and access to information that shouldn't be picked up by another team member. In enterprise, this becomes more and more paramount that these safeguards are kept in place. Process definitions doesn't always include the external collaborators. Think of this like APIs versus sharing the same common mono repo of Python code. As the companies grow, everyone cannot be working out of the same repo. Now, I know it works for Google, but when it comes to process of different teams and organizations, it becomes easier to set a demarcation between them, and that's a lot like an API. Although it may be influenced by the consumer of the external team, the actual end implementation is owned by a particular team and not that of the others. And teams affected by a change might not have an involvement in the change, and they may have phased migrations. So you can come up with this new whiz-bang idea. It could be cloud computing, it could be machine learning, it could be automation for network changes. But overall, before you can actually implement them, you have to get them signed off by review boards, and they don't understand why you're doing what you're doing. Or the support teams or teams that depend on you may need to be updated and patched before a big change goes out. Otherwise, their process is going to break and the whole entire train comes to a screeching halt. So when you think of enterprises as human networks, as they grow and grow, start thinking of teams and sub-organizations in an enterprise as their own data centers, and they have their own topologies for their particular use case. You could have an ad hoc sub-team structure with role grouping that handle intake collectively, but split the responsibility of addressing any concern or issue to a particular subset of those team members, whether it's through training or through separation of duties. Or you could have a single, possibly rotating intake form where a request for support comes into a random rotation and not any one person is the first person or first line of contact. You'll see this a lot in SRE or support rotation teams. You could have all individuals following the same set of policies, but independently work apart from each other. You'll see this often in review boards where they cross-check each other's work, but they don't follow in the footsteps of any other individual. Sometimes you'll have single intake subteams. So an organization or sub-organization may appear to be one large unit, but it could be broken up into subteams. For example, you could have the front-end developers versus the back-end developers, and they filter the requests and requirements to the team members through a single person, such as like a scrum master on an agile team. Or in other teams, you'll have a chain of command. A lot of support tier teams will have this, where you bubble up or down communication as necessary. But overall, These teams don't work together by individuals making individual connections, although that may happen sometimes. You may have a friend over in compliance that you can quickly get a process reviewed because he's intimately aware of what you're doing, but overall, those teams interact via their policies. That direct communication is still bound by the same process of their team, and you often don't get a huge entire skirting of a process or policy just to serve your or your team's needs. With that, the thing to remember though is that it's people over process. I'm sure you've heard this countless times over and over and over again, but those policies and processes are defined by the people who create them and maintain them. The processes are there and the policies are there to help teams work together in a consistent way in a common direction. So that policy or process may be internal to that team to follow through to make sure that they are following and maintaining everything consistently. So that way, when team member A does a change, team member B can quickly understand what team member A did while they are on vacation. Processes also become a contract in how to best engage a team. So if a team asks you to fill out a form or call a 1-800 support number, they typically are asking you to do that because it's easier for them to field your request and set priority and be more fair to the rest of the organization. So that contract is a way of exchanging information between them. And if you're looking to consume another team's resources, oftentimes they are the ones who get to dictate the contract. And like APIs, processes are written with yesterday's requirements and yesterday's vision, which means they may not be up to date with the best ideals for today. The spec was created before a new idea ever existed, or that idea was tried before and it failed because of past experiences or past technologies or past understandings. That doesn't mean it can't be reapplied today, but it could be that a gap in understanding is causing an idea to be represented even though the organization hasn't changed that much. Most importantly, the thing is to listen, adapt, and implement. Listen for the needs of yourself and other teams and the organization. Adapt your knowledge and the best practices that you are trying to implement. Again, like it could be cloud computing, it could be spinning up a data center, it could be automation, it could be many number of things. But listen and apply those and adapt them to the requirements of your organization. And then follow through. Implement for the most value, not the coolest technology. Because although the coolest technology may immediately solve your problems, it may cause other problems to arise. So thoroughly evaluate them. In small organizations, they become more nimble or they can adapt to when a new process has a gap or an oversight for a change that was unaware. So what do we do? Well, let's start with engaging the process. Because more importantly, like I said, when you engage with another team, you're engaging their process more than you are engaging with the individual person, at least initially. Accept the process as though it were a networking spec. It is a way that the team is defining to you how they best need to take in information. But remember, the final output must be the same and the documents need to be the same for them to properly intake your request, but the method of how that got there can be suspect of change. Some people open up the document and fill it out manually. Other teams may have all the information they need in sources of truth and in systems of record to fulfill that information in an automated fashion. And, on to my next point, automate and simplify the steps needed to collect that information. If you don't have it already, it may be easier for you to automate your process before pushing for adoption changes in the rest of the organization. And then lean into what the process covers that may not be obvious. Something in their process or their requirements is meeting a need they have that may not be obvious to you coming from a different responsibility or organization. Consider the processes as the demarcation line between teams. It's a standard protocol on how the teams can collaborate on a common initiative, which is the overall improvement and maintainability of the organization. But remember too, Specifications do evolve as the needs for them change. As more teams are looking to engage in automation, those teams that still have inefficient processes where you're filling out PDFs will eventually feel the burden of their inefficiencies in their process that may not have been inefficient in a past process or in a past time. And remember, compliance, risk management, and auditability are very important things in enterprises. They don't always rear their ugly heads in smaller organizations because the processes around them and mitigating them are easier to maintain and attain in those smaller organizations. But as companies grow, larger and larger legal and other bodies require organizations to behave in a streamlined and consistent fashion to protect the information and needs of others. But I said it's people over process. So let's talk about engaging the people behind the process. Accept the people as though they were network devices in production. They've agreed to operate in a particular way, and asking them to behave differently can have a negative impact on those that depend on them. They could be required to fill out documentation to sign off by their management or their regulatory body that they supply the information in a consistent manner. So it may not be obvious to you what the information is for, but it is painfully obvious for those team members why they need to collect that information or go through that process. But that doesn't mean you can't ask for clarification on why the steps exist in the process and if there's other ways that you can get that information to them. People may have access to undocumented streamlinings of that process, but they don't always advertise it because it sometimes causes more errors or more headaches on their side. And you can also suggest improvements or supply information in a new way that may make their lives easier that they may not be aware of. People create processes to minimize the headaches from compliance or unnecessary extra work on their end. They may not know all the possible ways to consume information and make the proper judgment call if a process is incorrect or inefficient. As people become smarter, so do the processes they create. And lastly, engage the enterprise. Accept the enterprise as though it were a data center or a series of data centers. Lots of moving parts, dependent on each other for full end-to-end functionality. Learn the value drivers for the organization. The same automation or new practice and technology may have been a net win for one organization, one you may have seen firsthand, but it could be a net loss for another. It could be because the rest of the organization isn't set up or aligned to do that. It could be a different vertical and it's not a best fit use case for them. But importantly, include multiple teams for a strike once, land many efficiency wins. Although the best value for your team could be one strategy or approach, but collectively across multiple teams, a slightly different or could be vastly different approach may be a net win for the entire organization as a whole. Not every need of every sub-team or organization will make sense, but those other teams are beholden to different sets of responsibilities and risks, and know when to compromise. You may not know everything about the other organizations, but listening and adapting and implementing your ideas to be a net win for the organization is going to be seen as a compromise and a better solution overall. And keep in mind, celebrate the yeses and learn to love the nos. Nos are rooted in a lack of understanding, and they teach you more than a yes ever will. You'll learn more about the organization when you get pushback than you will getting blind acceptance for a new adoption. And just like data centers, you can't turn them over overnight, at least not without a few drop packets and possibly a postmortem or two. So what can engineers do? I'm sure many of you are in different phases of your career. Some of you may be engineers, some of you are managers, some of you could be executives. But what can an engineer do today? Well, you can start with listening and collaborating. Understand the reasoning behind the process and impact from implementing your recommendations. You may have a recommendation to completely re-architect the source of truth, but are you aware of all the different dependent systems that depend on that source of truth, or how that change might wreak havoc in other systems? You can open up dialogues with new team members. That would be a great way to understand how your changes can impact those other teams. You can talk to review boards and risk evaluators for how they decide whether or not something is good to go or pump the brakes. And find technology best practices and certifications. It may seem trivially obvious, but if a best practice exists in the industry today, try to identify how your recommendations may differ from the best practice. And that best practice may not be aligned to your vertical, and that your interpretation may be better for your organization, but learn to know the differences. And obtain certifications and what certifications could be good for your team to take. And also learn about the regulatory and legal implications for your industry. Recommendations coming up against legal will trump every single time. But you can also enable yourself. Start small and focus on the tasks that you can improve, such as diagnostic playbooks. There are other talks today and yesterday that are going to cover quick ways that you can improve your process today, and you could probably share that amongst your team members and quickly get off the ground running and minimize the inefficient parts of your day. And automate the supplementary documentation for review meetings. There's no reason why you can't automate or improve your communications with other teams by understanding the requirements and finding ways to supply them through automation instead of just by doing it manually. But what can managers do? Well, managers also can listen and collaborate. They can ask critical questions from their team as far as their testing methods, how they can be certain that this change won't take down production, and whether or not they're up to date on their documentation and their support structures, especially if these teams do not keep the tier 1 support in their own team. They can set and explain meaningful guidelines and goals for adoption. Putting a bare minimum effort isn't always good for enterprises. It may quickly actualize value, but very quickly can cause havoc in the organization. And setting bare minimum standards for those and how the team can grow and adapt that adoption sets better metrics for the team to understand how to implement their changes. They can understand how the organization sizes and scopes risk. If you can understand them better yourself, it makes it easier for you to explain to your direct reports. They can also reach out to peers and executives about quick wins. It could be saving money on network traffic. It could be automating the configuration of end devices. It could be many different things, but understanding how other peers and executives see value in the organization makes it easier for them to relay the prioritization to their team. But also remember to enable your team as well. Encourage training and communication with the other teams. You don't have to do all the communications for them. And getting firsthand experience about what other teams need makes it easier for engineers to make better and more effective recommendations. And you can also explain that organizational risk and concerns and how to test for them. Maybe you can find ways to minimize the risk by showing exhaustive testing in a near production environment. But more importantly, starting today on enterprise adoption is better than starting tomorrow. Most organizations are too afraid to start, but odds are in today's world, more and more teams are starting to pursue automation, cloud technologies, and smarter and better processes to become nimble and put themselves out ahead of their competitors. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.